I'm Melissa, an ordinary woman in her 30s, living alone in a small yet cozy apartment in the city. After ending a complicated relationship, I decided to give dating apps a try, something I had always avoided. One day, while browsing with little expectation, I came across Jayson. At first, Jayson seemed like a nice guy. He was easy to talk to, attentive, and seemed interested in the same things as me. We exchanged messages for a few days, and he suggested we meet in person. Without much thought, I agreed, thinking it would be a good distraction. Our first date was awkward. Jayson was polite, but there was something in the way he looked at me, as if he was trying to read my every thought. During our conversation, he asked very personal questions that made me uncomfortable. Things like my daily routine, where I worked, and whether I lived alone. These are things you wouldn't normally ask on a first date. That's when I felt an internal alarm go off. That date was the first and last. In the days that followed, Jayson's messages became more frequent. He would send good morning and good night texts without fail, but soon they escalated into obsessive inquiries. Why didn't you respond? What are you doing right now? Can I come over? I blocked Jayson on all social media and the dating app itself. I thought that would solve the problem, but it was just the beginning. Jayson kept creating new accounts, trying to contact me in any way possible. The messages started to get more disturbing, hinting that he knew where I was and that he was watching me. I tried to ignore it, convinced that he would give up if I didn't respond. But deep down, fear began to grow, and I started questioning my own safety. The feeling of being watched, of being constantly observed, wouldn't leave me. I felt like my life was spiraling out of control, but I kept up with my routine, trying to pretend everything was fine. After all, Thanksgiving was coming up, and my family always gathered for that holiday. On Thanksgiving Day, I was determined to enjoy time with my family, despite the lingering unease caused by Jayson. My parents live in a peaceful suburban house where the trees shed leaves in shades of red and orange. It's a place where I've always felt safe. I thought maybe being there could help me forget what was happening. As soon as I arrived, I was greeted with hugs and smiles. The house was filled with the smell of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie. I tried to focus on the conversation, the laughter, and the food that always brought back good memories. But even surrounded by people, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After dinner, as everyone dispersed around the house, I decided to take a quick walk outside to clear my head. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought he was just someone from the neighborhood, someone I didn't know. But when I saw him standing at the corner under a tree, wearing that unmistakable black coat, my heart froze. It was Jayson. He was there, watching me, as if it was nothing. Panic surged through me, but I tried to stay calm. I looked back at my parents' house, full of life, laughter, and warmth, and a wave of anger washed over me. How dare he invade the one place where I still felt safe? I rushed back inside, feeling the panic rise with every step. I needed to tell someone, but I didn't want to alarm my mom or anyone else, so I went straight to my brother, Scott. He's always been protective, the kind of person who would stand up to anyone threatening the family. I pulled him aside and told him what was happening, my voice low but filled with urgency. Scott tried to calm me down, but I knew he was worried. He went outside to check, but Jayson was already gone. Even so, Scott promised to keep an eye out, which gave me some relief. We went back to dinner, but I could barely eat. Every noise, every shadow outside felt like a threat. Soon after, the messages started coming again. "You look beautiful today," read the first one. "I knew you'd be here," said another. He knew where I was, what I was doing, and it terrified me. I couldn't pretend everything was okay anymore. I decided it was time to leave before anything worse happened. I apologized to my family, making up an excuse about feeling tired. My brother insisted on walking me to my car, and even though I didn't want to involve anyone else, I agreed. The feeling of being followed, of something terrible about to happen, was overwhelming. When I finally got in the car, Scott stayed there until I was out of sight. I was grateful, but I knew the worst was yet to come. When I arrived at my apartment, the first thing I noticed was the door slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine, and my entire body tensed up. I knew I had locked the door when I left, and the fear that had been with me on the way back now turned into pure panic. My first thought was to call Scott, but I didn't want to make any noise that would give away my presence. With trembling hands, I pulled my phone from my pocket and activated speed dial. The line rang once, twice, until Scott's voice came through on the other end. Before I could speak, I heard something behind me, the soft sound of breathing. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and there he was. Jayson was standing in the living room staring right at me, a cold smile on his lips. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching me. My stomach turned. All the fear that had built up over the past weeks came crashing down on me. He didn't need to say anything. His presence there, in my most private space, was the biggest threat imaginable. "I knew you'd come back to me, Melissa," he finally said, his voice soft, almost friendly. My survival instinct kicked in, and I quickly hid my phone behind my back, hoping Scott could hear something of what was happening. "You shouldn't be here, Jayson," I managed to say, my voice nearly breaking. "Leave. I'm going to call the police." He laughed, a short, empty sound. "Call the police? They won't get here in time, Melissa. I just want to talk. You owe me that." His eyes were locked on me in a way that made my skin crawl. I knew I had to get out of there, but Jayson was between me and the door. I decided that the only way to escape was to get past him, and I had to move fast. I took a deep breath, gathering all the courage I could, and lunged forward. He tried to grab me, but I shoved him hard. I ran toward the door, but Jayson caught me by the arm, yanking me back forcefully. I screamed, struggling desperately to break free. That's when I heard Scott's voice shouting through the phone still in my hand. It seemed to distract Jayson for a moment, and I took the opportunity to kick his leg, giving me enough space to pull away. I managed to run into the hallway, but before I could reach the door, he was on me again, shoving me against the wall. Everything became a blur of pain and fear as we fought. I felt a sharp pain in my head, and for a moment, everything went dark. When I came to, I heard loud banging on the apartment door. "Police! Open the door!" Jayson hesitated, his face twisted in frustration. In a final effort, I pushed him with all the strength I had left, causing him to stumble backward. The door was kicked open, and within seconds, the police burst in, followed by Scott. Jayson was quickly subdued and arrested. I collapsed on the floor, exhausted, my body trembling uncontrollably. As the police led him away, the last thing I saw was Jayson's empty, cold stare fixed on me. Scott rushed to my side, holding me as I cried, relieved to finally be safe. That night, while the police searched my apartment, I found comfort in my family's presence. Scott stayed by my side, ensuring I knew I was safe now. The experience left its mark on me, but somehow it also made me realize a strength I never knew I had. Thanksgiving has always been one of my favorite holidays, and this year, my wife, our kids, and I were especially excited. We were headed to Uncle Ben's house, located in a secluded rural area by a lake. It was a place where I always felt at peace, disconnected from the chaotic world of the city. The trip there was long, but it was worth it. The kids were thrilled, imagining all the fun they'd have playing in the big yard, and my wife was talking about the feast she'd help Uncle Ben prepare. He's always been the perfect host, with his warm personality and endless stories about the good old days. When we arrived, Uncle Ben's house was just as I remembered. Large, dark wood, with huge windows offering a stunning view of the lake. The trees around the property had already shed their leaves, giving the place a melancholy air, but to me, it only added to the rustic charm of the house. Uncle Ben welcomed us with his strong hug and that smile that lit up his wrinkled face. He was the pillar of our family, always ready to welcome everyone with open arms. The day started off peacefully. The kids ran off to explore the grounds while the adults focused on preparing dinner. The smell of turkey roasting in the oven wafted through the house, and laughter echoed off the walls, bringing a sense of comfort. However, around midday, something began to bother me. While helping Uncle Ben bring in firewood from the pile he kept out back, I noticed something strange across the lake. There were a few figures standing there, watching us. I couldn't make out their faces, but their fixed gazes made me immediately uncomfortable. They didn't look like hunters or locals, and that made me uneasy. Uncle Ben noticed my silence and asked what was wrong. When I mentioned the people on the other side of the lake, he frowned. "They're probably just curious," he said, trying to reassure me. "This time of year brings a lot of tourists around here. Nothing to worry about." I tried to convince myself of that, but the discomfort didn't go away. We went back inside, and the rest of the afternoon went on as expected, but I couldn't forget those strangers. I mentioned it to my wife, who suggested we shouldn't give it too much thought. After all, we were all together and the house was safe. As the afternoon wore on, the discomfort I had felt earlier began to spread to the rest of the family. The kids, who had been running carefree around the yard, now stayed closer to the house, and my wife seemed quieter than usual. Uncle Ben, however, kept his usual relaxed demeanor, serving drinks and telling stories, trying to keep us distracted. Around 3 p.m., while we were finishing up the final preparations for dinner, something caught our attention outside. My brother-in-law, Steve, who was on the porch smoking a cigarette, came back inside with a tense expression. "There's someone on the access road," he said, his tone reflecting the concern we all felt. "They don't look lost. They're just watching." We all gathered at the front window, looking out at the dirt road leading to the house. There they were, the same figures I'd seen on the other side of the lake. But this time, they were closer, standing by a tree, clearly watching us. There were 3 men, all wearing dark clothing and caps that obscured part of their faces. Uncle Ben decided it was time to confront them. He grabbed a coat and headed out, with Steve and me right behind him. My wife tried to stop me, but I felt like I couldn't let Uncle Ben go alone. We walked together to the edge of the property, where the strangers remained motionless. "Can I help you with something?" Uncle Ben asked, his voice firm but friendly. One of the men stepped forward. "We're not doing anything wrong," he replied, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just taking a look around." There was something in the way he said it that put me on high alert. The tension in the air was palpable. Uncle Ben kept his composure, but his patience was clearly wearing thin. "You're on my property. If you don't have any business here, I suggest you leave." The man smiled again, this time more openly. "Understood," he said, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "We're just passing through." They slowly walked away, but the way they looked at us before disappearing into the forest made me feel like this was far from over. We returned to the house, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, but everyone was clearly on edge. Uncle Ben did his best to reassure us, but the tension was undeniable. As we set the table for dinner, we tried to resume light conversation, but it was obvious no one could relax. Then, without warning, we heard the sound of breaking glass. We rushed into the living room to find one of the front windows shattered, with a sizable brick on the floor, surrounded by shards of glass. My wife screamed in shock, and the kids started crying. I picked up the brick, and attached to it was a crumpled piece of paper with something hastily scrawled on it. "Leave." Panic set in. We knew this was no longer just a discomfort. It was a direct threat, and we couldn't ignore it any longer. Without hesitation, Uncle Ben grabbed the phone and called the police. The response wasn't reassuring. The house was in a remote area, and the response time would be longer than we'd like. While we waited, we did what we could to secure the house. We locked all the doors and windows and gathered the family in the central room, away from the windows. The kids were terrified, and I tried to calm them down, but my mind was racing, trying to figure out what was driving this harassment. The family was in shock, but relieved by the presence of the police. However, even with the added security, the feeling of vulnerability remained. The officers promised an investigation, but couldn't guarantee the culprits would be found. They only assured us that they would patrol the area throughout the night. That night, no one could sleep. We stayed together in the living room, the children finally falling asleep from exhaustion, while the adults took turns keeping watch. The house, which should have been a refuge, now felt like the site of something terrible. Night fell over Uncle Ben's house, bringing with it a darkness that seemed to weigh on us all. The only light came from the lamps we left on in the central room, where we were huddled together. The sound of the wind outside seemed louder, more menacing, as if it carried the presence of the strangers who were harassing us. We tried to keep the kids occupied, but fear was palpable in each of us. My wife couldn't stop glancing at the broken window, even after we had covered it with a makeshift board. Uncle Ben was silent, his eyes fixed on the door, as if expecting someone to break in at any moment. The footsteps outside continued, interspersed with whispers that seemed to draw closer and then recede. Every sound heightened my tension, and I knew everyone else felt the same. Each moment felt like something was about to happen. but the endless waiting only amplified the terror. Suddenly, the sound of something heavy hitting the house made us all jump. I rushed to the covered window and peeked through a crack. I saw nothing but darkness, but I knew they were still out there. I could feel them, waiting, testing us. "This isn't going to end well," Steve muttered, his voice laced with panic. Uncle Ben tried to calm everyone, but even he seemed shaken. "The police are on their way," he said, but his words felt hollow. Deep down, we all knew we were on our own until they arrived. As we waited, the conversation took an unexpected turn. My wife, always detail-oriented, mentioned that Uncle Ben had been quite vocal about his political opinions in recent weeks. He had spoken out at a community meeting on issues that clearly didn't sit well with everyone. This made us wonder, could these men be here because of that? Was the harassment politically motivated? It was hard to believe that on Thanksgiving, our family was being threatened over something like this, but nothing else made sense. As we discussed this possibility, something outside caught my attention. A shadow or movement, I couldn't be sure, but I felt it was a sign that the intruders were preparing for another attack. We all fell silent, every sound amplified by fear. At that moment, a new barrage of rocks hit the side of the house, making the kids scream and sending adrenaline rushing through my veins. It was too much. I decided I couldn't sit idly by any longer. I grabbed an old shotgun of Uncle Ben's that was stored in the basement. It wasn't a modern weapon, but it was enough to scare off anyone trying to break in. As I held the shotgun, a new sound filled the air, sirens. Faint at first, but quickly growing louder, closer. The blue and red lights of the police cars finally illuminated the path to the house. The intruders, realizing the police had arrived, vanished into the darkness as if they had never been there. The officers quickly entered, searching the area while Uncle Ben and I explained the situation. They found footprints around the house, rocks and bricks scattered across the yard, but the intruders had disappeared without leaving clear traces. I couldn't wait to spend Thanksgiving with my family. My mom, my sister, and I had always kept this tradition alive, gathering at her house in a quiet neighborhood in the city. This year, the weather wasn't cooperating. It had been pouring rain since morning, and the forecast predicted the storm would only get worse as the day went on. When I arrived, I found my mom in the kitchen, finishing up the dinner preparations. The smell of roasted turkey and apple pie filled the air, bringing a comforting sense of warmth that I looked forward to all year. My sister was already there, settled on the couch, flipping through the TV channels until she found the football game we all planned to watch while we ate. My mom's house was small but cozy. The windows were fogged up from the rain lashing outside, but inside, we were warm and safe. As we gathered around the table, the rain pounded against the glass, and thunder rumbled in the distance. It was the kind of night that made you feel grateful to be in a safe place, surrounded by the people you love. Dinner began peacefully. We talked about work, life, and memories of past holidays spent together. The sound of the television in the background mixed with the noise of the storm, creating a contrast between the chaos outside and the tranquility we felt inside. The game was almost at halftime when the doorbell rang. The unexpected sound made all of us look at each other. Who would be knocking at the door on a night like this with such a violent storm outside? My mom was the first to stand up, but I stopped her, saying I'd check who it was. I walked down the hallway, and peering through the window next to the door, I saw a man standing on the porch. He was completely drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead, and he was shivering from the cold. He looked exhausted, his clothes clinging to his body from the relentless rain. He glanced around as if expecting someone to appear soon, but what caught my attention was the desperate look in his eyes. "Please," he said, his voice muffled by the closed door but still audible. "I'm hungry. I just want some food." My mom, who had quietly approached, overheard his plea and immediately wanted to help. She's always had a big heart, incapable of denying help to someone in need, but something about this man made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he avoided looking me directly in the eyes, or the fact that he was there, alone, in the middle of a storm. "I'll get a plate of food for him," I told my mom, trying to keep control of the situation. She nodded, still worried, but agreed to stay in the living room. I went to the kitchen, put together a generous plate with the leftovers from dinner, and returned to the door. When I opened it just enough to pass the plate through, I realized he was closer than before, which made me step back a bit. "Thank you," he muttered. But instead of taking the plate, he tried to force his way in, pushing the door hard. I was caught off guard, but managed to react in time, shoving the door back against him. I felt the weight of his body on the other side, struggling to get in, and my heart raced. "Hey, what are you doing?" I shouted, trying to keep the panic out of my voice, but he didn't respond, only kept pushing, his eyes fixed on the entrance to the house, as if desperate to get in at any cost. The struggle over the door intensified, and soon my sister appeared, realizing what was happening. She rushed to help, putting her full weight against the door. Together, we managed to slam it shut with a loud bang, quickly locking it. The man started pounding on the door, shouting incomprehensible things while the rain hammered down even harder around us. My mom was in shock, her hands trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. We stood there breathless, not knowing what he would do next. The sound of the stranger's fists pounding on the door echoed through the house, mingling with the noise of the rain and thunder. My sister and I stood still for a few seconds, still processing what had just happened. My mom was sitting on the edge of the couch, in complete shock, unable to move or say anything. The man outside kept shouting and banging, each hit on the door increasing the panic inside me. We didn't know who he was, what he really wanted, or what he was capable of. All we knew was that he was desperate and willing to force his way in at any cost. "We need to call the police," my sister said, her voice trembling. I quickly nodded, pulling my phone from my pocket and dialing 911 with shaking fingers. I quickly explained what was happening, and the dispatcher promised to send a patrol car as soon as possible. But with the storm, there was no telling how long it would take. Meanwhile, the man's shouting and banging continued, but after a few minutes, there was a pause. I thought maybe he had given up, but my hope was quickly dashed when I heard heavy footsteps around the house. He was trying to find another way in. "We need to make sure all the windows and doors are locked," I said, trying to stay calm. My sister and I split up, checking every entry point in the house, locking windows, closing curtains, and turning off lights. The sound of footsteps outside heightened my anxiety with every passing second. When I returned to the living room, I found my mom still sitting there, now holding her hands tightly together, trying to control her fear. I sat next to her, trying to offer some comfort, but knowing there wasn't much I could do except wait for the police to arrive. Suddenly, a loud bang came from the back door. The man was trying to force his way in. I ran towards it, feeling the desperation grow, but before I could reach it, the noise stopped. Through the window, I saw a shadow moving quickly, heading back to the front of the house. He started pounding on the front door again, this time with something heavy. Each blow made the wood creak, and I feared it wouldn't hold much longer. My sister and I exchanged glances, the fear in her eyes reflecting my own. Finally, we heard the sound we'd been waiting for: sirens. Faint at first, but soon they were louder, closer. The red and blue lights of the police cars finally lit up the path to the house. The man, realizing the police had arrived, ran into the darkness, disappearing into the rain. The police arrived shortly after. 2 officers, drenched from head to toe, came into the house, their flashlights illuminating every corner as they asked questions. We recounted what had happened, and they inspected the area around the house, but the man had vanished without a trace. Even so, they promised to patrol the area throughout the night and advised us not to open the door to anyone. When we were finally alone, the tension still hung in the air, but now it was mixed with a sense of extreme exhaustion. None of us could sleep that night,